I still remember that December evening in Chicago, like it was yesterday. The snowflakes were gently falling outside the glass windows of the grand ballroom at the Palmer House Hotel, where our company was holding its annual awards ceremony. I had been working at Morrison & Associates marketing for 15 years, and at 62, I thought I had earned my place there. I wore my best black dress, the only one I could find in my size 22 that looked professional enough for such an elegant event. As I walked into that room filled with my colleagues, I felt a mixture of pride and nervousness. After all, our team had just closed the biggest deal in the company's history, and I had been the lead strategist on that project. The ballroom was magnificent, with crystal chandeliers hanging from an ornate ceiling and round tables decorated, with white roses and golden accents. My colleagues were already seated, wearing their finest attire, chatting and laughing while sipping champagne. I approached our table, where my team was supposed to be sitting. But as I got closer, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There were only 7 chairs around a table meant for 8 people. My nameplate was there, but there was no chair for me to sit on. "Excuse me," I said to my colleague Janet, a thin woman in her 30s who had always seemed friendly enough. "It looks like there's no chair for me." Janet looked up at me with what I can only describe as a mixture of annoyance and amusement. "Oh, Margaret," she said loud enough for others to hear. "Maybe they thought you'd need 2 chairs anyway." The comment hit me like a physical blow. The laughter that followed from my other colleagues felt even worse. I stood there, frozen, feeling the heat rise to my cheeks as other people at nearby tables turned to see what the commotion was about. But that was just the beginning. As I went to find an extra chair, I heard David, our department supervisor, making jokes behind my back. "Maybe Margaret should have stayed home tonight," he said, not caring that I could hear him. "At her age and size, she's really just dead weight around here anyway. I don't know why management keeps her around. She's as useless as they come." The words cut through me like knives. 15 years of dedication, of staying late, of going above and beyond, and this is how they saw me, as dead weight, as useless, as someone who didn't belong. If this story of a brave plus-size woman has already moved you, please hit that like button now so more people can watch this video. Let me tell you who I was before that devastating night changed everything. My name is Margaret Thompson, and I had spent my entire adult life being what society expected of me: quiet, accommodating, and invisible. I started working at Morrison & Associates when I was 47, right after my divorce. My ex-husband had always made comments about my weight, telling me I was lucky anyone would marry me looking the way I did. When we separated, I found myself alone for the first time in decades, needing to rebuild my life from scratch. I threw myself into my work with a passion I had never known I possessed. Marketing had always fascinated me, and despite having no formal education in the field, I learned everything I could. I studied consumer psychology, analyzed market trends, and developed strategies that consistently delivered results. Over the years, I had helped the company win major accounts, increase revenue by millions of dollars, and establish partnerships that were still generating income 15 years later. But despite my professional success, I had always struggled with my self-image. Growing up in the 1960s and 70s, there were no body-positive movements, no plus-size models in magazines, no representation for women who looked like me. I learned early that my worth was somehow tied to my appearance, and since I didn't fit the conventional standards of beauty, I convinced myself that I needed to compensate by being extra helpful, extra hardworking, and extra invisible. At work, I was the one who stayed late to finish projects when others left early. I was the one who brought homemade cookies for every office celebration, who remembered everyone's birthdays, who volunteered for the assignments no one else wanted. I thought that if I made myself indispensable through my work ethic and kindness, people would overlook my physical appearance and see my value. I had spent 15 years trying to earn acceptance through excellence, never realizing that some people had already decided I didn't deserve a seat at the table. Literally. My personal life was equally quiet. After my divorce, I had convinced myself that romantic love wasn't meant for women like me. I lived alone in a small apartment in Lincoln Park, filled with books about marketing and business strategy. My weekends were spent reading industry publications, working on freelance projects, or reorganizing my extensive collection of case studies. I had friends, but they were mostly other women my age who were also navigating life after divorce or widowhood. We would meet for coffee occasionally, but I never shared my deepest struggles with body image or the subtle discrimination I faced at work. That night at the Palmer House, sitting alone at a table I had to move from the back of the room, I felt something break inside me. It wasn't just embarrassment or hurt. It was the accumulated weight of decades of small humiliations, microaggressions, and the exhausting effort of trying to prove my worth in a world that seemed determined to find me lacking. As I watched my colleagues laugh and enjoy themselves at the table where I should have been sitting, I felt invisible in the worst possible way. I was there, but I didn't matter. My presence was inconvenient. My absence would be a relief. The worst part was the realization that this wasn't personal cruelty from one or two individuals. This was a systematic devaluation of who I was as a person. The missing chair wasn't an oversight, it was a message. David's comments weren't said in a moment of anger. They reflected a deeply held belief that women like me, older, larger, less conventionally attractive, simply didn't belong in professional spaces. The laughter from my colleagues wasn't nervous or uncomfortable. It was agreement, complicity in my humiliation. I sat through the entire ceremony feeling nauseous. When our team was called up to receive recognition for the major account I had helped secure, I watched from my isolated table as my colleagues walked to the stage without even glancing in my direction. The CEO praised their innovation and dedication, mentioning several team members by name. My name was never spoken. The project I had conceptualized, the strategy I had developed, the client relationship I had nurtured, all of it was credited to others while I remained invisible. As the evening wore on, I found myself analyzing every interaction I had witnessed over the past 15 years through a new lens. How many times had my ideas been dismissed in meetings, only to be praised? When repeated by someone else? How many times had I been excluded from important decisions, told it was because of scheduling conflicts, when I now realized it was because of who I was? How many times had I attributed professional setbacks to bad luck or office politics, when the truth was much simpler and more painful? I was being discriminated against because of my age and my weight. The drive home that night was one of the longest of my life. I sat in my car in the hotel parking lot for almost an hour, crying and trying to process what had happened. I felt ashamed for caring so much about other people's opinions, angry at myself for not standing up for my dignity, and devastated by the realization that 15 years of hard work and loyalty meant nothing to people who saw me as inherently less valuable than my thinner, younger colleagues. As I sat in that parking lot, my mind began racing through similar experiences I had endured over the years, moments I had minimized or explained away, but now recognized as part of a pattern of discrimination that had shaped my entire professional life. I remembered my first week at Morrison & Associates when I was introduced to the team during a lunch meeting at an upscale restaurant in downtown Chicago. The hostess had looked at me with barely concealed disdain and suggested we might be more comfortable at a different establishment with more accommodating seating. My new colleagues had laughed it off, but I spent that entire lunch perched uncomfortably on a chair that was clearly too small, trying to eat while managing my anxiety about taking up too much space. There was the time, 5 years into my tenure, when the company decided to update our professional headshots for the website and marketing materials. The photographer spent significant time with each of my colleagues, taking multiple shots, adjusting lighting, and offering posing suggestions. When it was my turn, he took exactly 3 photos, each one clearly rushed, and when the final images were selected for the website, Mine was notably smaller than everyone else's and placed at the bottom of the page. When I mentioned this to HR, I was told it was probably just a layout consideration and that I was being overly sensitive. I thought about the countless business trips where I had been subjected to subtle and not so subtle comments about airplane, seats, hotel accommodations, and restaurant booths. During one particularly painful conference in New York, a colleague named Ryan had loudly announced to our group that we should warn the restaurant about seating arrangements when making reservations, while looking directly at me. When I had presented our company's strategy to potential clients that same trip, Ryan had interrupted me multiple times, eventually taking over the presentation entirely. Later, our supervisor praised Ryan's leadership and initiative, while my preparation and research went unacknowledged. The memory that hurt the most, though, was from just 2 years earlier. Our department was being reorganized, and I had applied for a senior strategist position that I was uniquely qualified for. I had developed the frameworks that the entire department was using, had the most experience with our major clients, and had consistently exceeded all performance metrics. Instead, the position went to Jessica, a woman 15 years younger than me with half my experience. When I asked my supervisor for feedback on my application, he told me that while my work was adequate, the company was looking for someone with more energy and better client-facing presence. Jessica was a size 6 with perfect makeup and designer clothes. The message was clear, even if it was never explicitly stated. Each of these memories felt like pieces of a puzzle that were finally coming together, forming a picture I had been too afraid or too naive to see clearly. This wasn't about my performance, my qualifications, or my contributions. This was about living in a society that had decided my body made me inherently less valuable, less professional, less worthy of respect and recognition. 3 days after the company event, I found myself sitting in my apartment on a cold Sunday morning, still replaying that humiliating evening in my mind. I had called in sick to work for 2 days, something I had never done in 15 years unless I was genuinely ill. I couldn't face walking into that office and pretending everything was normal, pretending that I could continue being the cheerful, accommodating Margaret who absorbed insults with a smile and worked twice as hard to prove she deserved basic human dignity. As I sat there in my pajamas, drinking my 3rd cup of coffee and staring out at the gray Chicago skyline, I had what can only be described as a moment of absolute clarity. I realized that I had been living my entire adult life according to rules that other people had written for me, rules that said I should be grateful for whatever scraps of respect and recognition I received, rules that said I should compensate for my appearance by being extra agreeable and extra humble, rules that said my worth as a human being was somehow diminished by the size of my body. For 62 years, I had accepted the premise that there was something inherently wrong with me, something that needed to be fixed or hidden or apologized for. I had spent decades trying to make myself smaller, not just physically, but in every way possible. I spoke softly in meetings, I apologized constantly, I downplayed my achievements, I accepted credit for other people's mistakes, and I convinced myself that this was just the price I had to pay for existing in professional spaces as a larger woman. But sitting there that morning, something fundamental shifted in my thinking. I began to question why I had accepted this treatment for so long. Why had I convinced myself that other people's cruel comments reflected something true about my worth? Why had I spent so much energy trying to earn acceptance from people who had already decided I didn't deserve it? Why had I allowed my professional achievements to be overshadowed by other people's prejudices about my appearance? I got up and walked to my home office, where I kept detailed records of every project I had worked on during my 15 years at Morrison & Associates. As I reviewed my files, I began to see my career through different eyes. I had been responsible for bringing in over $12 million in new business. I had developed marketing strategies that were still being used by the company. I had mentored dozens of younger employees, many of whom had been promoted to positions above me. I had received commendations from clients, positive performance reviews, and had never missed a deadline or budget target. The evidence was undeniable. I was not only competent, I was exceptional. The problem wasn't my performance. The problem was a workplace culture that valued appearance over achievement, youth over experience, and conformity over excellence. And in that moment of clarity, I decided that something needed to change, not just for me, but for every woman who had ever been made to feel invisible because she didn't fit society's narrow definition of acceptable. That Sunday morning became the turning point of my entire life. After reviewing my professional accomplishments and finally seeing my worth clearly for the first time in decades, I made 3 decisions that would transform not only my own future, but also challenge the very system that had tried to diminish me. First, I decided that I would never again apologize for taking up space or asking for what I deserved. Second, I would document every instance of discrimination I could remember and any future incidents that occurred. And third, I would find a way to use my skills and experience to create something bigger than myself, something that would ensure other women wouldn't have to endure what I had experienced. My first step was research. I spent the next 2 weeks using my vacation days to investigate employment law, workplace discrimination, and the experiences of other women who looked like me in corporate America. What I discovered was both validating and infuriating. Age, poor, and weight discrimination were rampant in professional environments, but they were also often subtle enough to be difficult to prove. However, when patterns of discrimination were documented over time, they could be addressed through legal channels. I began keeping a detailed journal of every workplace interaction, every meeting where my ideas were dismissed or attributed to. Others, every comment about my appearance or capabilities. I also started reaching out to former colleagues who had left the company, and what I learned shocked me. 3 other women over 50 had left Morrison & Associates in the past 5 years, all citing feeling undervalued and overlooked for promotions despite strong performance records. 2 of them specifically mentioned feeling uncomfortable about comments regarding their age and appearance. But I wasn't just planning to address my own situation. I was beginning to envision something much larger. During my research, I had connected with dozens of women across the country who were facing similar challenges. I learned about the incredible talent and experience that was being wasted because companies were making decisions based on outdated stereotypes rather than actual capabilities. I realized that there was an enormous opportunity to create businesses and organizations that would value substance over superficial characteristics. The more I researched, the more confident I became. I discovered that companies with more diverse leadership teams, including age diversity, consistently outperformed their less diverse competitors. I found studies showing that teams with members over 50 brought unique problem-solving abilities and client relationship skills that younger teams often lacked. I learned about successful businesses that had been founded by women in their 60s and 70s, proving that innovation and entrepreneurship weren't limited to young people in hoodies working out of garages. By the end of those 2 weeks, I had transformed from a devastated woman questioning her worth into someone with a clear mission and a strategic plan. I was going to return to Morrison & Associates, but not as the same Margaret who had left. I was going back as someone who knew her value and was prepared to demand the respect and recognition she had earned. Are you a plus-size woman watching this? Have you been through something similar? Share in the comments and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more empowerment stories. When I walked back into the Morrison & Associates office after my 2-week research period, I felt like a completely different person. Not because I looked different. I was wearing the same professional attire I had always worn, carrying the same briefcase, walking through the same corridors I had navigated for 15 years. The difference was internal, a fundamental shift in how I saw myself and my place in that environment. For the first time in my professional life, I walked into that office knowing exactly who I was and what I was worth. The reaction from my colleagues was immediate and noticeable. When I spoke up in the weekly team meeting that first day back, suggesting a modification to our current campaign strategy, there was a moment of surprised silence. I had always shared my ideas before, but usually tentatively, with phrases like, "I might be wrong, but," or "This probably isn't important, but." This time, I presented my suggestion with confidence and clarity, backing it up with research and data. Instead of waiting for someone else to validate my idea, I explained why it would work and what resources we would need to implement it. David, our department supervisor, who had called me useless at the company event, tried to dismiss my suggestion with his usual condescending tone. "Margaret, that's an interesting thought, but I think you might be overthinking this." In the past, I would have immediately backed down, apologized for wasting everyone's time, and remained silent for the rest of the meeting. Instead, I looked him directly in the eye and said, "Actually, David, I've analyzed the market data extensively, and I believe this approach could increase our client retention by at least 15%. I'd be happy to present the full analysis to the team if you'd like to see the numbers." The room went quiet. My colleague Janet, who had made the comment about needing 2 chairs, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Ryan, who had overshadowed me in countless presentations, looked genuinely surprised. But what happened next was even more significant than their surprise. I felt a surge of power and confidence that I had never experienced before. I realized that I had been giving away my authority for years, diminishing my own voice before anyone else even had the chance to dismiss me. Over the following weeks, I continued to practice this new way of being. When someone interrupted me during presentations, I politely but firmly said, "I'd like to finish my point, please." When my ideas were repeated by others without attribution, I spoke up immediately. "Thank you for building on the strategy I presented last week, David. I'm glad you found it valuable." When someone made a comment about my appearance or age, I addressed it directly. "I'm not sure how that's relevant to our work objectives. Could we focus on the project at hand?" The most surprising discovery was that standing up for myself didn't create the conflict and confrontation I had feared. Instead, it earned me more respect than I had ever received during my years of trying to be accommodating and invisible. Clients began asking specifically for me to lead their projects. Junior employees started seeking my advice and mentorship. Even some of my colleagues who had previously dismissed me began treating me differently, as if they were seeing me clearly for the first time. My newfound confidence began manifesting in ways that surprised even me. 3 weeks after returning to work with my new mindset, an opportunity arose that would have terrified the old Margaret, but felt perfectly manageable to the woman I was becoming. Our biggest client, Millennium Manufacturing, was experiencing a crisis with their brand image after a product recall, and they needed immediate strategic support. The project was high stakes, high visibility, and exactly the kind of challenge that had always been given to younger team members while I was assigned to support roles. When our department head announced the project in our Monday meeting, I did something I had never done before. I volunteered to lead it, not assist with it, not support someone else's leadership, but actually take charge of the entire strategic response. The silence in the conference room was deafening. David looked at me as if I had suggested we all quit our jobs and join the circus. Janet actually laughed, a nervous, uncomfortable sound that revealed more about her discomfort than mine. "Margaret," David said in his most patronizing voice, "this is a very complex situation that requires someone with experience handling crisis communications." I looked at him calmly and replied, "I have 15 years of experience with this client and have managed their communications through 3 previous product launches and 2 regulatory challenges. I believe I'm exactly the right person for this project." Then I did something that shocked everyone in the room, including myself. I stood up and began outlining my preliminary strategy for handling Millennium's crisis. For the next 20 minutes, I presented a comprehensive approach to crisis management that drew on every project I had worked on, every case study I had analyzed, and every client relationship I had built over my career. I spoke with authority about media relations, stakeholder communications, and reputation recovery strategies. I referenced specific examples from similar cases and provided realistic timelines for implementation. When I finished, the room was completely silent. The department head, Patricia Williams, had been taking notes throughout my presentation. She looked up at me and said, "Margaret, that's exactly the kind of strategic thinking we need for this project. I'd like you to present this approach to the client tomorrow." David started to protest, suggesting that perhaps I could support the client presentation while someone else took the lead, but Patricia cut him off. "No, Margaret clearly has the strongest grasp of both the client relationship and the strategic requirements. She'll lead the Millennium Response Team." That night, I went home and realized I was experiencing something I had never felt before in my professional life: pure excitement about a work challenge. Not anxiety about whether I was qualified enough, not worry about whether I would embarrass myself, not fear about taking up too much space or asking for too much authority. Just genuine enthusiasm for the opportunity to use my skills and experience to solve a complex problem. I spent the evening preparing for the client presentation, but for the first time in years, it felt like play rather than work. The next morning, as I dressed for the meeting with Millennium Manufacturing, I made another, small but significant decision. Instead of trying to minimize my presence through dark, conservative clothing that would help me blend into the background, I chose a bright blue blazer that I had owned for years but never worn to work. It was professional, it fit me well, and it made me feel confident and visible. As I looked in the mirror before leaving my apartment, I realized that for the first time in decades, I wasn't trying to hide. The presentation to Millennium Manufacturing became a defining moment, not just in my career, but in my understanding of what was possible when I stopped limiting myself based on other people's expectations. I walked into their Chicago headquarters that Tuesday morning, carrying myself differently than I ever had before. Instead of trying to make myself smaller and less noticeable, I occupied space with confidence. When we were introduced to the Millennium executives, I looked each person in the eye, gave firm handshakes, and spoke clearly when stating my name and role. The presentation itself was unlike anything I had ever experienced. For 45 minutes, I held the attention of 12 senior executives as I outlined my strategy for managing their crisis communications. I presented data analysis, proposed messaging frameworks, and provided detailed timelines for implementation. When the CEO of Millennium, Robert Chen, asked challenging questions about potential risks and alternative approaches, I answered with expertise and confidence. I wasn't just hoping they would accept my ideas. I knew my recommendations were solid, and I presented them as such. But the real test came when David, who had accompanied me to the meeting as additional support, began trying to undermine my presentation. Midway through my section on stakeholder communications, he interrupted to suggest that perhaps we should take a more conservative approach given the complexity of the situation. In the past, I would have immediately deferred to his opinion, apologized for any confusion, and allowed him to redirect the conversation. Instead, I paused, looked at him calmly, and said, "David, I appreciate your concern, but the research clearly shows that proactive, transparent communication is the most effective approach for this type of crisis. I'd be happy to share the case, studies that support this strategy." The Millennium executives were watching this exchange with obvious interest. Robert Chen leaned forward and said, "Margaret, we'd like to hear more about those case studies. Your approach seems well-researched and strategic." For the next 15 minutes, I detailed examples from 3 similar situations, explaining how companies that had used transparent, proactive communication strategies had not only recovered from their crises, but had actually strengthened their market positions. David sat in silence, clearly frustrated but unable to argue with the evidence I was presenting. At the end of the presentation, something unprecedented happened. Robert Chen addressed me directly, asking if I could personally oversee their crisis response. Not the team, not the department, but me specifically. He said, "Margaret, you clearly understand our business and have the experience to guide us through this situation. We'd like Morrison & Associates to assign you as the lead strategist for this project." It was the first time in 15 years that a client had specifically requested my leadership. The drive back to our office was tense. David spent the entire time trying to diminish what had just happened, suggesting that the client was probably just being polite and that we would need to assign a more senior team member to actually manage the project. But when we arrived back at Morrison & Associates and reported the meeting results to Patricia Williams, her response was immediate and clear. "If the client specifically requested Margaret, then Margaret will lead the project. This is exactly the kind of confidence we want to build." That afternoon, I found myself in a position I had never experienced before, being envied rather than pitied by my colleagues. Janet stopped by my desk to ask how I had suddenly become so confident, as if my 15 years of experience and expertise had materialized overnight. Ryan made several comments about how some people get lucky breaks, completely ignoring the fact that this opportunity was the direct result of my knowledge and preparation. But their reactions didn't bother me the way they might have in the past. I was beginning to understand that their discomfort said more about them than it did about me. The Millennium Manufacturing Project became the catalyst for a complete transformation in how I saw myself and my capabilities. Over the 6 weeks I spent managing their crisis communications, I experienced success after success that made it impossible to maintain the diminished self-image I had carried for so long. The strategy I had developed worked exactly as I had predicted. Their brand reputation not only recovered, but actually improved as stakeholders appreciated their transparent, proactive approach to addressing the product recall. But more importantly, I began to recognize patterns of excellence in my work that I had never acknowledged before. When Millennium's stock price not only stabilized, but actually increased during the crisis response period, I realized that this wasn't luck or coincidence. It was the direct result of strategic decisions I had made. When their customer satisfaction scores reached an all-time high 6 weeks after the product recall, I understood that my approach to stakeholder communication had been not just adequate, but exceptional. The external validation from the client was significant, but the internal transformation was even more powerful. I started keeping a daily journal of my professional accomplishments, not because I needed to prove anything to anyone else, but because I wanted to train my mind to recognize my own worth. Each evening, I would write down at least 3 things I had done well that day, 3 problems I had solved effectively, 3 ways I had contributed value to my team or clients. This practice revealed something remarkable. I had been excelling consistently for years, but I had trained myself not to notice my successes. I had become so focused on trying to compensate for perceived deficiencies that I had become blind to my actual strengths. As I documented my daily achievements, I began to see myself as the skilled professional I actually was, rather than the inadequate imposter I had imagined myself to be. The change in my self-perception began affecting every aspect of my life. I started speaking up more in meetings, not because I was trying to prove anything, but because I had valuable contributions to make. I began dressing in colors and styles that made me feel confident rather than invisible. I started accepting compliments gracefully instead of deflecting them with self-deprecating comments. Most significantly, I stopped apologizing constantly for things that didn't require apologies: my ideas, my presence, my expertise. One pivotal moment came during a department meeting where Patricia Williams was discussing performance evaluations. She mentioned that the Millennium Manufacturing Project had been one of the most successful client engagements in the company's recent history, and that it had led to additional contracts worth over $2 million. When she credited the success to excellent strategic leadership, I felt a surge of pride instead of my usual impulse to minimize my role. After the meeting, Patricia asked to speak with me privately. "Margaret," she said, I need to ask you something directly. Have you ever considered applying for senior management positions? Your work on the Millennium Project demonstrated exactly the kind of strategic thinking and client management we need at the leadership level. For a moment, I was speechless. 6 months earlier, I had been sitting at a company event feeling worthless and invisible. Now I was being asked to consider senior leadership. My response surprised even me. Instead of immediately listing all the reasons why I might not be qualified for such a role, I found myself saying, "Yes, Patricia, I would definitely be interested in discussing leadership opportunities. I believe my experience and track record position me well for increased responsibility." As I spoke those words, I felt something shift permanently in my sense of professional identity. I wasn't just an employee trying to earn acceptance. I was a leader ready to claim the authority I had earned. With my newfound confidence and recognition of my professional worth, I began to see opportunities and solutions that had been invisible to me during my years of trying to remain small and accommodating. The discrimination and marginalization I had experienced for 15 years at Morrison & Associates weren't just personal challenges. They were systemic problems that were likely affecting other talented women throughout the organization and across the industry. I realized that my unique perspective as someone who had been undervalued despite strong performance gave me insights that could benefit not just myself, but many others. I started by conducting informal research within our own company. During lunch conversations and coffee breaks, I began asking other women about their experiences with advancement opportunities, project assignments, and workplace dynamics. What I discovered was both disturbing and motivating. Sarah, a brilliant analyst in her early 50s, had been passed over for 3 promotions despite consistently exceeding performance targets. Carmen, a strategic planner in her late 40s, had been told she might want to consider less client-facing roles as she got older. Jennifer, who had recently returned from maternity leave at 38, was suddenly being excluded from high-profile projects. The pattern was unmistakable. Morrison & Associates, like many professional service firms, had an informal but pervasive bias against women who didn't fit the narrow demographic of young, thin, conventionally attractive professionals. Talented, experienced women were being marginalized not because of their capabilities, but because of assumptions about their value based on age, appearance, or life circumstances. But rather than simply documenting these problems, I began developing solutions. I proposed to Patricia Williams that we create a formal mentorship program pairing experienced women with rising professionals, ensuring that institutional knowledge and expertise were being transferred effectively. I suggested implementing blind resume reviews for internal promotions, where initial screening would be based solely on qualifications and performance metrics. I recommended establishing clear, measurable criteria for project assignments to prevent subjective decisions that might be influenced by unconscious bias. Perhaps most significantly, I began identifying external opportunities that could benefit from the untapped talent I was seeing within our organization. During my work with Millennium Manufacturing, I had learned that they were struggling to find consulting partners who truly understood their industry and customer base. Many of their previous consultants had been young teams with impressive credentials, but limited real-world experience. I realized that the very characteristics that were being devalued at Morrison & Associates, maturity, extensive experience, deep industry knowledge, were exactly what many clients actually needed. This insight led me to develop what I called the Strategic Experience Initiative, a proposal for creating specialized teams of senior professionals who could offer clients the depth of knowledge and strategic perspective that only comes with decades of experience. Instead of treating age and experience as limitations, we would market them as premium services for clients facing complex, high-stakes challenges. The initiative included detailed financial projections showing how these senior teams could command higher fees and achieve better client retention rates than our traditional project teams. I researched case studies from other consulting firms that had successfully positioned experience as a competitive advantage. and I developed marketing materials that emphasized wisdom, strategic thinking, and proven problem-solving abilities over energy and innovation. When I presented the Strategic Experience Initiative to Patricia Williams, her response was immediate enthusiasm. "Margaret, this is exactly the kind of strategic thinking we need to differentiate ourselves in the market. The consulting industry has become obsessed with youth and novelty, but many of our clients are looking for wisdom and proven expertise. I'd like you to develop a full implementation plan for this initiative. If you believe that obese women can achieve anything, subscribe to the channel and share this video with a friend who needs empowerment." The Strategic Experience Initiative became the foundation for the most successful period of my professional life. Within 3 months of presenting the concept to Patricia Williams, I had been promoted to Senior Director of Strategic Development and was leading a team of experienced consultants in developing specialized service offerings for our most sophisticated clients. The promotion came with a significant salary increase, a corner office, and for the first time in my career, genuine respect from colleagues who had previously dismissed or ignored me. But the real validation came from client response. When we launched the Strategic Experience Initiative, we positioned it as a premium service for clients facing complex challenges that require deep industry knowledge and proven problem-solving approaches. Instead of competing on price or promising revolutionary innovations, we emphasized the value of wisdom, experience, and strategic perspective that could only come from professionals who had successfully navigated multiple business cycles and industry transformations. Our first major client for the initiative was Chicago Metropolitan Bank, which was struggling with a digital transformation that had stalled under the guidance of a younger consulting team. The previous consultants had recommended cutting-edge technologies and innovative approaches, but they hadn't adequately considered the bank's regulatory requirements, existing customer relationships, or organizational culture. When I led our experienced team in conducting a comprehensive review of their situation, we were able to identify practical solutions that the previous consultants had overlooked. The results were remarkable. Within 6 months, Chicago Metropolitan Bank had successfully implemented a digital banking platform that not only met their technological goals, but also strengthened customer satisfaction and regulatory compliance. The bank's CEO, Patricia Morrison, specifically credited our team's approach, saying, "Margaret and her team understood our business in ways that previous consultants couldn't. Their experience and strategic perspective were exactly what we needed to navigate this transformation successfully." The success with Chicago Metropolitan Bank led to additional opportunities that exceeded our most optimistic projections. Within 9 months, the Strategic Experience Initiative had generated over $4 million in new revenue for Morrison & Associates. More importantly, it had achieved client satisfaction scores that were 20% higher than our traditional consulting services. Clients consistently praised the depth of understanding, strategic insight, and practical wisdom that our experienced teams provided. The professional transformation was remarkable, but the personal transformation was even more significant. For the first time in my adult life, I was being valued specifically for who I was, rather than despite who I was. My age wasn't a limitation to overcome. It was a qualification that set me apart from competitors. My extensive experience wasn't something to downplay. It was the foundation of my expertise. Even my physical appearance seemed irrelevant in an environment where my contributions were so clearly valued. The change in how colleagues treated me was dramatic and immediate. David, who had called me useless at the company event less than a year earlier, now sought my advice on strategic planning for his own projects. Janet, who had made jokes about my need for 2 chairs, was suddenly interested in joining my team. Ryan, who had repeatedly overshadowed me in presentations, was now asking if I could mentor him in client relationship management. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came during our annual company awards ceremony, held ironically at the same Palmer House Hotel where I had been humiliated the previous year. This time, I walked into that ballroom as the evening's keynote speaker, invited to present the Strategic Experience Initiative as a model for industry innovation. As I stood at the podium, looking out at my colleagues, I could see the shock and admiration on faces that had previously regarded me with condescension or indifference. The success of the Strategic Experience Initiative created opportunities for me to impact lives far beyond my own professional transformation. As word spread throughout Chicago's business community about our innovative approach to valuing experience and expertise, I began receiving invitations to speak at conferences, industry associations, and professional development events. What started as presentations about consulting strategies evolved into discussions about workplace equity, the value of diverse perspectives, and the untapped potential of professionals who had been marginalized by ageist and appearance-based discrimination. My first speaking engagement outside of Morrison & Associates was at the Chicago Women in Business Association, where I was invited to discuss the Strategic Experience Initiative as a case study in innovation. As I prepared for that presentation, I realized that my story wasn't just about business strategy. It was about transformation, resilience, and the power of recognizing your own worth. When I stood before an audience of 200 professional women and shared my journey from feeling invisible and worthless to leading a multi-million-dollar initiative, the response was overwhelming. During the question and answer session, woman after woman stood up to share their own experiences of being undervalued, overlooked, or discriminated against because of their age, appearance, or other characteristics that had nothing to do with their professional capabilities. A 55-year-old financial analyst talked about being told she was overqualified for positions she knew she was perfect for. A marketing director in her early 60s described how she had been gradually excluded from client meetings after a new, younger manager joined her team. A project manager who had recently gained weight due to medication shared how colleagues had started treating her differently, as if her expertise had somehow diminished along with their perception of her attractiveness. But what was most powerful about that evening wasn't just the shared experiences of discrimination. It was the energy and determination that emerged when these talented women realized they weren't alone and that change was possible. After my presentation, dozens of women approached me to ask about creating similar initiatives at their own companies or to explore opportunities for collaboration. I realized that the Strategic Experience Initiative wasn't just changing Morrison & Associates. It was providing a model for transformation that could be replicated across industries. Within 6 months, I had been invited to speak at events in Detroit, Milwaukee, Indianapolis, and St. Louis, sharing the story of how valuing experience and expertise had created competitive advantages for our company while also advancing equity and inclusion. Each presentation led to consulting opportunities, as organizations recognized that they were likely overlooking valuable talent within their own workforce. I began developing workshops and assessment tools to help companies identify and leverage the expertise of professionals who had been marginalized or undervalued. The most rewarding aspect of this work was seeing other women experience their own transformations. Sarah, the analyst who had been passed over for 3 promotions, joined the Strategic Experience Initiative and within a year was leading a team of consultants working with healthcare clients. Carmen, who had been steered away from client-facing roles, became one of our most successful business developers, using her maturity and communication skills to build relationships with senior executives who appreciated her professional approach. But the impact extended beyond individual success stories. Companies that implemented versions of our Strategic Experience Initiative began reporting improved client satisfaction, better employee retention, and increased revenue from their consulting services. A study conducted by Northwestern University's Business School found that organizations emphasizing experience and expertise alongside innovation achieved 23% higher profitability than those focused solely on youth and novelty. By the second anniversary of that humiliating company event, my professional life had transformed so completely that it sometimes felt like I was living someone else's story. The Strategic Experience Initiative had evolved from a single program at Morrison & Associates into a consulting practice that was generating opportunities across multiple industries. Patricia Williams approached me with a proposal that would have seemed impossible just 2 years earlier. The chance to lead a new division focused entirely on strategic consulting for mature markets and complex organizational challenges. The new division, which we called Strategic Wisdom Solutions, would be housed within Morrison & Associates, but would operate with significant autonomy to develop its own client relationships, service offerings, and team structure. More importantly, it would be staffed primarily by experienced professionals who had been undervalued or overlooked by traditional consulting firms. Patricia explained that she wanted to position Morrison & Associates as the industry leader in recognizing and monetizing the expertise that most firms were ignoring. As I considered this opportunity, I realized how dramatically my perspective on career advancement had changed. 2 years earlier, I had been grateful for any recognition or opportunity, no matter how small. I had trained myself to accept whatever was offered and to never ask for more than what others thought I deserved. Now, I found myself evaluating Patricia's proposal not with gratitude, but with strategic assessment. Was this the best way to use my skills and experience? Would this position allow me to create the kind of impact I wanted to have? Did the compensation and authority match the value I would be providing? After careful consideration, I accepted the role, but with conditions that reflected my new understanding of my worth. I negotiated a salary that was 30% higher than what was initially offered, equity participation in the revenue generated by my division, and the authority to hire and structure my team according to my vision rather than existing company protocols. Most significantly, I required that Strategic Wisdom Solutions be positioned as a premium service, not as a discount alternative for clients who couldn't afford younger, more expensive teams. The launch of Strategic Wisdom Solutions exceeded everyone's expectations, including my own. Within the first year, we had signed contracts with 12 major clients, including 3 Fortune 500 companies that specifically sought out our services because they needed the kind of strategic perspective that only comes with extensive experience. Our client retention rate was 95%, compared to the industry average of 68%. Our profit margins were 40% higher than traditional consulting services, proving that clients were willing to pay premium rates for genuine expertise and proven problem-solving abilities. But perhaps the most satisfying aspect of Strategic Wisdom Solutions was the team I was able to assemble. I recruited talented professionals who had been marginalized by other firms because of age, appearance, health conditions, or other characteristics that had nothing to do with their capabilities. Maria, a brilliant operations consultant who used a wheelchair, brought insights about accessibility and universal design that transformed how our clients approached workplace optimization. Robert, a financial strategist in his late 60s who had been forced into early retirement, provided expertise in regulatory compliance and risk management that prevented several clients from making costly mistakes. Each team member brought not only professional expertise, but also a depth of understanding about resilience, adaptability, and strategic thinking that could only come from navigating professional challenges as marginalized individuals. We weren't just consultants, we were problem solvers who understood complexity, adversity, and the importance of finding creative solutions when conventional approaches failed. The success of Strategic Wisdom Solutions began attracting attention from business media and industry publications. Harvard Business Review published a case study about our approach, titling it The Competitive Advantage of Professional Experience. Forbes featured me in their Innovation in Consulting series, highlighting how Strategic Wisdom Solutions was changing industry assumptions about value and expertise. The success of Strategic Wisdom Solutions inevitably attracted attention from competitors and critics who were threatened by our challenge to traditional consulting industry norms. 18 months after launching the division, I faced the biggest professional challenge of my career when Morrison & Associates was acquired by Global Tech Consulting, a multinational firm known for its emphasis on young talent and technology-driven solutions. The acquisition brought with it new leadership that viewed our approach with skepticism and our success with suspicion. The new management team, led by CEO Jonathan Mitchell, a 38-year-old former tech executive, made it clear from their first company meeting that they intended to modernize Morrison & Associates by eliminating what they saw as outdated business models and refocusing on digital innovation and agile methodologies. During a presentation to the combined leadership teams, Mitchell specifically criticized consulting approaches that relied on legacy thinking and traditional methods, making it obvious that Strategic Wisdom Solutions was being targeted for elimination. The corporate politics were complex and demanding, but they were nothing compared to the personal attacks that followed. Industry publications that had previously praised our innovative approach suddenly began running articles questioning whether experience-based consulting was simply old-fashioned thinking disguised as innovation. Competitors circulated rumors that our success was due to clients who were too unsophisticated to appreciate modern consulting methodologies. Some critics even suggested that our focus on experienced professionals was a form of reverse discrimination against younger consultants. The most challenging obstacle came when Mitchell announced that all division leaders would need to undergo performance evaluations based on contemporary consulting metrics that emphasize technology adoption, social media presence, and alignment with modern business practices. It was clear that these evaluations were designed to justify eliminating Strategic Wisdom Solutions by creating performance standards that we couldn't meet, not because we lacked capability, but because we refused to abandon the principles that made us successful. Rather than accepting this challenge passively, I decided to meet it head-on by demonstrating the measurable superiority of our approach. I spent 3 weeks preparing a comprehensive presentation that compared Strategic Wisdom Solutions' performance metrics to those of Global Tech's traditional consulting divisions. The data was overwhelming. Our client satisfaction scores were 38% higher, our project completion rates were 25% better, our cost overruns were 60% lower, and our revenue per consultant was 42% above the company average. But I didn't stop with internal metrics. I commissioned an independent study by Deloitte Consulting to evaluate the long-term impact of our strategic recommendations compared to those of traditional consulting teams. The study found that clients who implemented our recommendations achieved sustained improvements that lasted an average of 3.2 years longer than those who followed advice from younger, less experienced consultants. The difference was attributed to our deeper understanding of organizational dynamics and our focus on sustainable solutions rather than dramatic innovations that often failed during implementation. When I presented these findings to the Global Tech leadership team, the room was silent for several minutes. Mitchell, who had clearly expected to use the performance evaluation as justification for eliminating our division, was confronted with evidence that Strategic Wisdom Solutions wasn't just successful. It was significantly outperforming every other part of the organization. The independent validation from Deloitte made it impossible to dismiss our results as statistical anomalies or luck. Patricia Williams, who had remained as a senior advisor after the acquisition, spoke up during the tense silence that followed. My presentation. Jonathan, I think the data speaks for itself. Strategic Wisdom Solutions isn't just a successful division. It's a competitive advantage that could transform Global Tech's entire consulting practice. Margaret has proven that valuing experience and expertise isn't outdated thinking. It's exactly what sophisticated clients are looking for. Do you see how a determined, overweight woman can change not only her life, but other people's lives too? Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications for more stories like this. The performance evaluation that was meant to eliminate Strategic Wisdom Solutions instead became the catalyst for the most extraordinary transformation of my career, and the moment when all the humiliation and discrimination I had endured was finally vindicated in the most public and satisfying way possible. 3 days after my presentation to the Global Tech leadership team, Jonathan Mitchell called me into his office for what I assumed would be a private discussion about the future of my division. Instead, I found myself in a room with the entire Global Tech board of directors, including chairman of the board Elizabeth Harrison, a 64-year-old former CEO who had built her reputation on strategic acquisitions and operational excellence. Elizabeth looked directly at me and said, "Margaret, your presentation earlier this week has sparked significant discussion at the board level. We've spent considerable time analyzing not just your division's performance metrics, but the implications of your approach for our entire organization. We'd like to discuss some possibilities that go far beyond maintaining strategic wisdom solutions as a single division." The tone of her voice and the attention of everyone in the room made it clear that this conversation was going to be unlike anything I had anticipated. What followed was a 2-hour discussion that fundamentally changed my understanding of what was possible in my career and my life. The board had not only been impressed by Strategic Wisdom Solutions' performance metrics, they had been conducting their own analysis of industry trends and client feedback across all of Global Tech's divisions. What they discovered was that clients were increasingly frustrated with consulting firms that emphasized innovation over implementation, creativity over competence, and novelty over proven results. Elizabeth explained that Global Tech had been losing major clients to smaller, more experienced consulting firms that offered exactly the kind of strategic perspective and reliable execution that Strategic Wisdom Solutions had demonstrated. "Margaret," she said, "we believe your approach isn't just a successful division, it's the future of strategic consulting. We'd like to discuss the possibility of you leading a company-wide transformation that positions Global Tech as the premier firm for experienced, results-oriented consulting." The opportunity they presented was staggering in its scope and implications. They wanted me to become Senior Vice President of Strategic Operations with authority over all of Global Tech's consulting divisions, a role that would involve transforming the entire organization's approach to client service, talent recruitment, and market positioning. The position would come with a compensation package that was more than triple my current salary, equity participation in the company's growth, and the resources to implement strategic changes across Global Tech's offices in 12 countries. But perhaps most significantly, they wanted me to use Global Tech as a platform for challenging industry-wide assumptions about value, expertise, and professional worth. Elizabeth explained that they envisioned Global Tech becoming the first major consulting firm to explicitly position experience and proven expertise as premium services, creating a new market category that other firms would be forced to follow. As I listened to their proposal, I realized that this moment represented more than just a career opportunity. It was the complete reversal of every assumption that had been made about my worth and potential throughout my professional life. My personal compensation had grown to reflect my contribution, but more importantly, I had been able to create opportunities for hundreds of other professionals who had been undervalued by traditional consulting firms. The most meaningful recognition, however, came from clients whose organizations had been transformed by our strategic guidance. CEOs and senior executives regularly credited our experienced consulting teams with helping them navigate complex challenges that younger consultants had been unable to address effectively. These testimonials weren't just professional validation. They were proof that valuing experience and expertise created real value for organizations and their stakeholders. As I reflect on the woman I have become, compared to the person who sat alone at that company event 4 years ago, the transformation feels almost miraculous. But I understand now that it wasn't magic. It was the natural result of finally recognizing and claiming the value I had always possessed. Today, at 66 years old, I am living a professional and personal life that would have been unimaginable to the Margaret who once tried to make herself invisible and apologized for taking up space. Professionally, I have achieved a level of success and influence that extends far beyond what I once thought possible. As Senior Vice President of Strategic Operations at Global Tech Consulting, I oversee operations across 12 countries and lead a team of over 800 experienced consultants who are transforming how organizations approach strategic challenges. Our division generates over $400 million in annual revenue and maintains client satisfaction scores that are consistently the highest in the industry. But more importantly, I have become a leader who uses her platform to create opportunities for others who have been marginalized or undervalued. The strategic wisdom model that we developed at Global Tech has been implemented by over 200 organizations worldwide, creating career opportunities for thousands of experienced professionals who had been overlooked by traditional corporate structures. I have personally mentored 67 women over 50 who have gone on to achieve senior leadership positions in their respective industries. The personal transformation has been equally profound. I no longer apologize for existing, for speaking up, for taking up space, or for advocating for what I deserve. I dress in clothes that make me feel confident and powerful rather than invisible. I speak with authority about my expertise and accomplishments. Most significantly, I have learned to see my age, my experience, and even my physical appearance as assets rather than limitations to overcome. The change in how others perceive and treat me reflects this internal transformation. Colleagues seek my advice and value my opinions. Clients specifically request my involvement in their most critical strategic initiatives. Industry peers recognize me as a thought leader whose insights have shaped the direction of the consulting profession. But perhaps most satisfying is that the respect I receive now feels genuine and earned rather than polite or patronizing. My personal life has also been transformed by the confidence and self-worth I've developed. I have begun dating for the first time since my divorce 18 years ago, approaching relationships from a position of strength and self-knowledge rather than desperation or gratitude. I have reconnected with old friends and formed new relationships based on mutual respect and shared interests rather than my previous pattern of trying to earn acceptance through excessive accommodation. The financial success has provided security and opportunities that were previously unimaginable. I own a beautiful condominium overlooking Lake Michigan, travel internationally for both business and pleasure, and have been able to establish a foundation that provides scholarships and career development opportunities for women over 50 who are seeking to advance their professional lives. But the most significant aspect of my transformation is the impact it has had on other women facing similar challenges. When I speak at conferences or write articles about the journey from marginalization to leadership, I consistently hear from women who tell me that my story has inspired them to recognize their own worth and to demand the respect and opportunities they deserve. Knowing that my transformation has created a pathway for others to follow gives meaning to everything I endured during those years of feeling invisible and undervalued. The Margaret who sits in corner offices and boardrooms today is fundamentally the same person who was humiliated at that company event 4 years ago. But she is a woman who finally understands her worth and refuses to accept anything less than the respect and recognition she has earned through her expertise, experience, and contributions. If you also believe in the transformative power of plus-size women, hit that like button and comment on how this story inspired you. As I conclude this journey with you, I want to speak directly to every woman who is watching this video and recognizing herself in the struggles I've shared. Whether you're dealing with discrimination because of your weight, your age, your appearance, or any other characteristic that has nothing to do with your capabilities, I need you to understand something fundamental. The problem is not with you. The problem is with a system that has taught us to undervalue ourselves and to accept treatment that we would never tolerate for someone we love. For 62 years, I believed that my worth was diminished by my appearance and that I needed to compensate for my perceived deficiencies by being extra agreeable, extra hardworking, and extra invisible. I spent decades trying to earn acceptance from people who had already decided I didn't deserve it, and I convinced myself that their treatment of me reflected something true about my value as a human being. I was wrong about all of it. Your worth is not determined by your dress size, your age, or your ability to conform to narrow beauty standards that were designed to exclude rather than include. Your value comes from your experience, your wisdom, your capabilities, your compassion, and your unique perspective on the world. The same characteristics that society has taught you to see as limitations may actually be your greatest strengths if you have the courage to recognize and claim them. The transformation I've shared with you wasn't about changing who I was. It was about finally accepting who I had always been and refusing to hide that person any longer. It was about recognizing that the voice in my head telling me I wasn't good enough wasn't my voice. It was the echo of a society that profits from women's insecurity and self-doubt. When I finally silenced that voice and started listening to my own wisdom and experience, everything changed. I want you to know that it's never too late to begin this transformation. Whether you're 45 or 75, whether you've been marginalized for 5 years or 50 years, whether you're just beginning to recognize your worth or you've been fighting for recognition your entire life, you have the power to change your story. You have expertise that matters, perspectives that are valuable, and capabilities that deserve recognition and respect. The world needs what you have to offer. Organizations need your experience and wisdom. Younger women need your example and mentorship. Society needs your voice and your refusal to remain invisible. But most importantly, you need to give yourself permission to be seen, to be heard, and to take up the space you deserve. Start where you are, with what you have, in whatever situation you're facing right now. Speak up in that meeting. Apply for that promotion. Wear the color that makes you feel confident. Stop apologizing for having opinions, for taking up space, for asking for what you deserve. Document your accomplishments. Advocate for yourself with the same energy you would use to advocate for someone you love. Remember that every time you refuse to accept discrimination or marginalization, you're creating space for other women to do the same. Every time you claim your worth and demand respect, you're challenging systems that depend on women undervaluing themselves. Your transformation isn't just about your own life. It's about changing the world for every woman who comes after you. The company event, where I was humiliated and called useless, was the beginning of my transformation, not the end of my story. Your beginning might be different, but your power is the same. You have everything you need to create the life and career you deserve. The question isn't whether you're capable enough, experienced enough, or worthy enough. The question is whether you're ready to stop accepting anything less than the respect and recognition you've already earned. If this plus-size empowerment story touched your soul, subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, share it with someone special, and write in the comments what city and country you're watching from.